Ladies and gentlemen, today we dive into one of the most notorious prisons in El Salvador, La Esperanza Prison. This facility, known as Mariona, holds some of the most dangerous women in the country, female members of the infamous MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs. Their stories are a reflection of El Salvador's brutal gang wars, extreme poverty, and a justice system struggling to control organized crime. La Esperanza Prison, also known as Mariona, was originally built to house 800 inmates. However, due to El Salvador's ongoing war against gangs and the government's aggressive crackdown on criminal organizations, the facility now holds more than 4,000 prisoners, a number 5 times its intended capacity. This extreme overcrowding has led to severe humanitarian issues, making La Esperanza one of the most notorious and inhumane prisons in the world. The lack of space forces prisoners to live in horrific conditions. Many inmates have to sleep on the concrete floor or share small, filthy mattresses with multiple people. Cells, which were designed for a handful of prisoners, now cram dozens of women together, leaving them barely enough room to sit or lie down. The stench of sweat, sewage, and rotting food fills the air, creating an unbearable atmosphere. The prison lacks proper sanitation facilities, with overflowing toilets, clogged sewage systems, and a constant shortage of clean water. This leads to frequent outbreaks of diseases, including skin infections, tuberculosis, and gastrointestinal illnesses, which spread rapidly in the overcrowded environment. Food scarcity is another major issue. Prison meals are minimal and often inedible, consisting of watery soup, a small portion of beans, and stale bread. Many inmates suffer from malnutrition, and fights frequently break out over food. Water is strictly rationed, with some prisoners going days without drinking enough clean water, leading to dehydration and severe health problems. Overcrowding also means that medical care is almost non-existent. With thousands of prisoners and only a handful of medical personnel, sick inmates are often ignored. Those suffering from serious illnesses, including chronic conditions like diabetes or heart disease, receive little to no treatment. Pregnant women, who are sometimes arrested due to their gang affiliations, are forced to endure unbearable conditions without proper prenatal care, increasing the risks of miscarriage or complications during childbirth. The psychological effects of overcrowding are equally devastating. Prisoners live under constant stress, fear, and anxiety, knowing that a fight or an act of violence could erupt at any moment. Gang rivalries between MS-13 and Barrio 18 do not stop at the prison walls. They continue inside, where prisoners must constantly watch their backs. The lack of space and privacy creates a claustrophobic environment, pushing many inmates into depression, paranoia, and suicidal thoughts. Suicide rates inside La Esperanza are high, as many prisoners lose hope of ever escaping the brutal conditions they endure daily. The prison guards, overwhelmed by the sheer number of inmates, are often corrupt, abusive, or indifferent. Some guards turn a blind eye to gang violence, while others actively participate in smuggling drugs, weapons, or other contraband into the prison. Bribery is common, with wealthier prisoners gaining better treatment, while the poorest and weakest are left to fend for themselves. In summary, the extreme overcrowding in La Esperanza Prison has turned it into a living hell. Instead of functioning as a place of reform, it has become a breeding ground for further crime, violence, and despair. The government's aggressive incarceration policies have only worsened the problem, leading to a situation where the prison is not just a punishment, but a death sentence for many of its inmates. When people think of gangs like MS-13 and Barrio 18, they often imagine male-dominated groups where women play a minor or passive role. However, the reality is far different. Women in these gangs are not just supporters or messengers. Many of them are deeply involved in the brutality, leadership, and operations of these criminal organizations. Their roles range from assassins, extortionists, and drug traffickers to recruiters, and even high-ranking decision-makers within the gang hierarchy. Most of the female inmates in La Esperanza Prison were not arrested for minor offenses. Many were actively involved in some of the most violent crimes committed by their gangs. Some women order assassinations, manage the gang's financial operations, or even act as enforcers, carrying out brutal punishments against those who betray the gang. Others are deeply involved in drug smuggling operations, working as couriers or overseeing drug distribution within different territories controlled by MS-13 and Barrio 18. Many of these women joined the gangs at a young age, often as a result of extreme poverty, abuse, or a lack of other opportunities. In El Salvador, gang culture is deeply embedded in many communities, and for some young girls, joining a gang feels like the only way to survive. Some are recruited as teenagers, lured in by promises of protection, status, and financial support. Others are forced into gang life, especially if they come from families that are already involved in gang activity. For some, joining a gang provides a sense of belonging and power in a society that offers them very little. In many cases, women who grew up in abusive households see the gang as a place where they can fight back and take control of their lives, even if it means engaging in crime and violence. The gang becomes their family, and loyalty to the gang is often more important than anything else, even their own safety. However, this loyalty comes at a terrible price. Women in gangs are not only fighters and leaders, they are also victims. Despite their active roles, they often face severe gender-based violence within their own gangs. Many are subjected to sexual abuse, forced relationships, and brutal punishments if they are suspected of betrayal. Some women are forced into relationships with high-ranking male gang members, with little choice in the matter. If they try to leave or disobey orders, the punishment is often torture, rape, or execution. Inside La Esperanza Prison, female inmates remain deeply loyal to their gangs. Even behind bars, they continue to operate within the strict rules and structures of MS-13 and Barrio 18. These gangs maintain hierarchies inside the prison, and women must follow orders from their leaders, even if it means carrying out acts of violence against fellow inmates. Gang loyalty does not stop at the prison gates. It extends to every aspect of their lives, even behind bars. In prison, these women continue to participate in criminal activities, including running extortion schemes, smuggling drugs, and coordinating operations with gang members outside. Despite being locked up, their influence often extends beyond the prison walls, as they communicate with fellow gang members through hidden messages, corrupt guards, or smuggled cell phones. For many of these women, prison is not an escape from gang life. It is just a new battlefield. They are surrounded by rival gang members, constantly watching their backs to avoid violent confrontations. The prison authorities often separate MS-13 and Barrio 18 members to prevent riots, but fights and killings still happen regularly. Any sign of weakness, betrayal, or disobedience can result in a brutal beating, or worse, death. Women who wish to leave the gang life face nearly impossible odds. In the outside world, gang members who attempt to quit are often hunted down and executed. Inside prison, they are viewed as traitors and often targeted for violence. The few who try to break free from the gang often live in constant fear, knowing that their past will always follow them. In La Esperanza, these women are trapped in a cycle of violence, loyalty, and survival. Many of them never had a real choice. They were either born into this life, forced into it, or manipulated by a system that gave them no other options. Now, locked inside a prison that offers no rehabilitation, no escape, and no second chances, their only hope is survival, at any cost. One of the biggest failures of La Esperanza Prison is that it does not function as a place for rehabilitation. Unlike modern prison systems that focus on reforming criminals and preparing them for reintegration into society, La Esperanza is strictly a punitive institution. The government's main objective is to lock up gang members and keep them isolated from the public, rather than providing them with education, job training, or psychological support that could help them leave their criminal past behind. For many of the female inmates, this lack of rehabilitation means that they remain trapped in the same violent cycle that led them to prison in the first place. Most of them grew up in poverty, faced domestic violence, or were recruited into gangs at a young age. Many of these women never had access to proper education, legal employment opportunities, or positive role models. The gang was often the only family they knew, offering them protection and a sense of belonging. However, once they enter prison, nothing changes. They receive no counseling, no skills training, and no support to help them start a new life. Lack of education and job training. One of the biggest issues in La Esperanza is the complete absence of educational programs. In many other countries, prisons provide literacy programs, vocational training, and job placement services to help inmates reintegrate into society after their release. However, in La Esperanza, these opportunities are non-existent. The few programs that do exist are poorly funded, and only a small number of prisoners can participate. Most women spend their days in overcrowded cells, with nothing to do but survive. Without education or job training, these women have no hope of building a future outside of prison. If they are released, they will have no skills, no employment prospects, and no support system, leaving them with no choice but to return to gang life. This is why many former inmates end up back in prison within months or even weeks of their release. Psychological and emotional trauma. Many of the women in La Esperanza suffer from severe psychological trauma. Before their arrest, they were often victims of abuse, forced marriages, sexual violence, and extreme poverty. Some have seen their family members murdered in front of them or have been forced to kill as part of gang initiation rituals. These experiences leave deep emotional scars, and without therapy or psychological support, these women are left to struggle with PTSD, depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. Instead of receiving mental health treatment, most of these women are simply locked away and forgotten. In many cases, the extreme stress and trauma of prison life only make their psychological problems worse. Suicide rates are high, and many women turn to self-harm or substance abuse as a way to cope with their suffering. The government's iron fist approach. El Salvador's government has adopted a zero-tolerance policy toward gang members, known as the mano dura, iron fist approach. Under this strategy, thousands of people, including many women, have been arrested and imprisoned without any efforts to rehabilitate them. The government believes that the best way to deal with gangs is to lock them up indefinitely, rather than investing in programs that could help them leave behind their criminal past. However, this strategy has severe consequences. Instead of breaking the cycle of violence, it makes the problem worse. Many young women who are arrested have never even committed a violent crime. They may have been involved in smuggling drugs, acting as lookouts, or simply being in a relationship with a gang member. But once they enter La Esperanza, they are forced to live among hardened criminals, and many end up becoming even more deeply involved in gang activities. Brutality of prison life. With no rehabilitation programs to keep them occupied, many inmates fall deeper into gang culture inside prison. Gang leaders continue to run their criminal operations from behind bars, using smuggled phones and corrupt guards to communicate with the outside world. Women who were once low-ranking members on the streets can quickly rise in the gang hierarchy while in prison, making them even more dangerous when they are eventually released. The lack of productive activities also leads to rising tensions and violence inside the prison. With nothing to do all day, gang rivalries escalate, and fights often break out over small disputes, food shortages, or power struggles. Guards do little to stop these conflicts, and in many cases, they intentionally allow gang members to attack each other as a way of controlling the prison population. No second chances. For most women in La Esperanza, prison is not a place where they can turn their lives around. It is a place where they are abandoned. Even if they want to leave the gang life behind, they have no resources, no support, and no opportunity to do so. Many of them were arrested at a young age and given long sentences with no possibility of parole. Even those who do manage to complete their sentences face huge obstacles when they are released. Employers refuse to hire them, their families may have disowned them, and their former gang may view them as a liability or a traitor. In many cases, women who leave prison are killed by their former gang members, as the organization no longer trusts them. Others are forced back into gang life simply to survive, since no one else will give them a chance. Without proper rehabilitation, the vast majority of these women will never escape the cycle of crime and incarceration. Instead of being reformed, they leave La Esperanza even more damaged, violent, and hopeless than when they entered. The El Salvadoran government has waged an all-out war against gangs, implementing extreme measures to dismantle criminal organizations like MS-13 and Barrio 18. President Nayib Bukele, in particular, has taken a zero-tolerance approach, leading to the mass incarceration of suspected gang members. While this crackdown has been praised for reducing crime, it has also led to severe human rights violations, overcrowded prisons, and the arrest of many individuals who may not even be involved in gang activities. The state of exception and mass incarceration. In 2022, El Salvador declared a state of emergency in response to rising gang violence. Under this policy, the government suspended constitutional rights, allowing security forces to arrest thousands of individuals without warrants or evidence. This policy has resulted in more than 75,000 arrests, many of them women, swelling the prison population to unprecedented levels. Among those arrested, many are suspected female gang members, some of whom are genuinely involved in organized crime, while others may have been taken into custody simply for having a tattoo, living in a gang-controlled area, or being related to a gang member. Human rights organizations argue that these sweeping arrests have led to countless innocent people being locked away in places like La Esperanza Prison, where they face inhumane conditions, violence, and indefinite detention. The role of women in the crackdown. While the government has primarily focused on arresting male gang members, thousands of women have also been caught in this mass crackdown. Many of them were involved in gang operations, working as money handlers, recruiters, drug mules, or even enforcers. Others were arrested simply because they were in a relationship with a gang member, had suspected connections, or refused to cooperate with authorities. In El Salvador's gang culture, women often play a dual role, both as perpetrators and victims. Some women rise in the ranks of MS-13 and Barrio 18, participating in murders, extortions, and smuggling operations. However, others are forced into these roles under threat of death. The government's broad approach makes little distinction between voluntary gang members and those who were coerced, meaning that many innocent or unwilling participants end up behind bars alongside hardened criminals. Overcrowding and lack of due process. As a direct result of the mass arrests, prisons like La Esperanza have become dangerously overcrowded, with thousands of women crammed into cells meant for a fraction of that number. Inmates often sleep on the floor, go days without food or water, and suffer from disease outbreaks due to unsanitary conditions. Additionally, many of those arrested never receive a fair trial. The government's crackdown has overwhelmed the legal system, and some prisoners are held for months or even years without charges. Reports indicate that many inmates die in custody before ever seeing a judge, either due to violence, medical neglect, or suicide. The lack of due process means that once someone is arrested, their chances of proving their innocence are almost non-existent. Harsh punishments and indefinite detention. Under President Bukele's policies, prisoners are given long sentences with little chance of early release. The government has increased penalties for gang-related crimes, with many female gang members receiving sentences of 30 years or more. For women who may have been involved in gangs under coercion or extreme poverty, these harsh sentences leave no room for redemption. Even those who want to turn their lives around are left with no legal options, no rehabilitation programs, and no chance of appeal. Once they are labeled as gang members, they are treated as criminals for life, even if they never personally committed a violent act. The controversy over mass arrests. While the crackdown has led to a significant drop in crime rates, it has also sparked international criticism. Human rights groups argue that the government's tactics violate basic freedoms, targeting not only gang members, but also innocent civilians. Reports have emerged of wrongful arrests, torture, and deaths in custody, raising concerns about police brutality and corruption. Furthermore, many argue that the crackdown fails to address the root causes of gang violence, such as poverty, lack of education, and limited job opportunities. Without addressing these issues, critics warn that the gang problem will continue, even if thousands of members are locked away. Impact on families and communities. The government's mass arrests have devastated families, leaving many women and children without their primary breadwinners. Mothers, daughters, and sisters have been arrested alongside their male relatives, leading to entire families being torn apart. For young children whose mothers are imprisoned, the consequences are severe. Many end up on the streets, where they become easy targets for gang recruitment, creating a new generation of criminals. Others are forced into poverty and homelessness, making it even more difficult for them to escape the cycle of violence that has gripped El Salvador for decades. La Esperanza Prison, also known as Mariona, is one of the most violent and dangerous prisons in El Salvador. Originally built to hold a small number of inmates, it is now severely overcrowded due to the government's aggressive crackdown on gangs like MS-13 and Barrio 18. Inside its walls, brutality is a daily reality. Prisoners are not only subjected to inhumane conditions, but also to extreme violence, gang warfare, and abuse from both guards and fellow inmates. For the female prisoners of La Esperanza, life is a constant battle for survival. Many of them were members of rival gangs before their incarceration, and their gang affiliations do not disappear once they are locked up. Instead, these rivalries become even more intense and deadly. Violence is a form of power, and those who cannot defend themselves are often beaten, tortured, or even killed. Gang control and power struggles. Inside La Esperanza, the prison authorities have little real control. Instead, power lies in the hands of the gang leaders, who enforce their own rules and punishment systems. MS-13 and Barrio 18 maintain strict hierarchies, and any inmate who disobeys orders, shows weakness, or betrays the gang faces brutal consequences. Gang leaders decide who gets food, who gets protection, and who is punished. Those at the bottom of the hierarchy suffer the most. They may be forced to serve higher-ranking members, perform dangerous tasks, or endure endless beatings as part of their initiation into prison life. If a woman was a high-ranking gang member outside the prison, she might continue to hold influence behind bars. But if she was low-ranking or suspected of being disloyal, she is often targeted for violence. Some women are accused of snitching to the authorities or betraying their gang, and such accusations almost always lead to violent retribution. The brutal punishments and killings. Violence inside La Esperanza is not random. It is systematic and calculated. Prisoners who step out of line face severe beatings, torture, or execution at the hands of fellow inmates. Some common forms of punishment include beatings. Inmates accused of disrespect or betrayal are often brutally beaten by multiple prisoners at once. These beatings can last for hours, leaving victims with broken bones, internal injuries, and sometimes death. Stabbings. Shanks and makeshift knives are smuggled into the prison, and inmates who cross the wrong people are stabbed repeatedly, sometimes in front of the entire cell block as a warning to others. Strangulation and suffocation. Some killings are carried out quietly, with prisoners being strangled or suffocated in their sleep. Forced suicides. Inmates who are considered a liability to their gang are sometimes given an ultimatum: kill themselves or be killed. Sexual violence. Though not as widely reported due to fear and stigma, sexual violence is a hidden but rampant problem. Female prisoners, especially young or new inmates, are often vulnerable to assault by both inmates and corrupt prison guards. The prison guards rarely intervene in these acts of violence. Many of them are either too afraid to challenge the gang leadership or actively involved in the corruption, turning a blind eye in exchange for bribes. Some guards even facilitate the violence, smuggling in weapons, and letting gang members carry out their own form of justice inside the prison walls. Daily life under constant fear. For the women of La Esperanza, every day is a fight for survival. There is no escape from the violence. The walls that are meant to keep them locked away from society also trap them inside a war zone. Inmates must always be on guard, watching their backs and avoiding any action that could be seen as disrespectful or suspicious. Even a simple mistake, a wrong look, or talking to the wrong person can lead to deadly consequences. Many prisoners suffer from severe psychological trauma, experiencing constant paranoia, anxiety, and depression. The sound of screams, fights, and deaths is an everyday part of life, making sleep and peace almost impossible. Some prisoners have been so broken by the violence and fear that they lose their sanity, descending into madness or suicidal despair. Corruption and guard brutality. While gang violence is a major threat inside La Esperanza, the guards themselves are often just as brutal. Instead of protecting prisoners, some guards engage in their own forms of abuse. Reports from former inmates and human rights organizations describe beatings by guards. Prison staff frequently beat prisoners for minor infractions or simply to maintain control through fear. Extortion. Guards often demand bribes from inmates, forcing them to pay for basic necessities like food, water, and medicine. Torture as punishment. Some guards punish prisoners by locking them in isolation cells with no food or light for days. Others are subjected to physical torture, including electric shocks and forced stress positions. Sexual abuse. Some corrupt guards exploit female prisoners, demanding sexual favors in exchange for better treatment or protection. Those who refuse may be beaten or sent to the most dangerous sections of the prison. Because the government's focus is on mass incarceration rather than prison reform, these abuses go largely unchecked. Many inmates never report the violence out of fear of retaliation, knowing that there is no real justice inside La Esperanza. Gang executions and power shifts. In such a violent environment, power shifts frequently. If a gang leader is transferred, killed, or overthrown, new leadership takes over, and this often results in a wave of executions as the new leaders eliminate rivals and suspected traitors. Sometimes, the government itself uses violence to control the prison population. There have been reports of mass killings of inmates during crackdowns, where security forces enter the prison and kill dozens of prisoners in a single raid. These operations are officially described as security measures, but many believe they are extrajudicial executions meant to reduce the gang population through force. A never-ending cycle of violence. Instead of rehabilitating prisoners, La Esperanza turns them into hardened criminals. Women who entered prison as low-level gang members or mere associates often leave as fully committed criminals, having learned new tactics, formed stronger gang connections, and developed a deep hatred for the system that imprisoned them. Because of the extreme violence, many inmates lose all hope of ever living a normal life. Even if they survive their sentence, they know that once they leave La Esperanza, they will either be hunted by their former gang, rejected by society, or rearrested in another mass crackdown. For many of the women inside, prison is not just a place of punishment, it is a slow, violent death sentence. Corruption is deeply embedded in the prison system of El Salvador, and La Esperanza prison is no exception. Rather than being a facility controlled by the government, La Esperanza is a battleground of power between gang leaders, corrupt prison guards, and even high-ranking officials who use the prison system for their own benefit. For many inmates, survival inside La Esperanza is not just about physical strength, it is about knowing how to navigate the system of corruption. Bribes, smuggled goods, secret alliances, and underground deals are all part of daily life. Those who have money or connections can buy their way into better treatment, protection, and privileges, while those who are poor or powerless are left at the mercy of both the gangs and the guards. The corrupt prison guards, bribery, abuse, and smuggling. The guards at La Esperanza are supposed to maintain order and enforce prison rules, but in reality, many of them are active participants in the prison's criminal operations. Low salaries, lack of oversight, and fear of gang retaliation have turned many guards into willing or reluctant collaborators in the corruption. Bribery and favoritism. Bribery is a common practice in La Esperanza. Prisoners with access to money, either from family members or through gang networks, can pay guards for better living conditions, extra food, medical care, and even weapons. The amount of money an inmate has directly determines their quality of life behind bars. Prisoners who pay bribes can be transferred to less violent cell blocks, where they are safer from gang rivalries. Those who refuse to pay or cannot afford to bribe guards are often placed in overcrowded, more dangerous areas, where they are vulnerable to assault, extortion, and torture. Some guards sell information to gang leaders, alerting them about which inmates are suspected traitors or informants, often leading to targeted beatings or executions. Corrupt guards charge inmates for access to basic necessities, including soap, toilet paper, and clean drinking water. If a prisoner cannot pay, they are forced to live in filth and desperation. Smuggling of weapons, drugs, and phones. Despite the government's claims of tight security measures, La Esperanza is filled with contraband, much of it smuggled in by the very guards who are supposed to prevent it. Weapons, homemade knives, shanks, and even firearms have been found inside La Esperanza, allowing gangs to maintain their internal power struggles and execute enemies with ease. Drugs, cocaine, methamphetamine, and marijuana are widely available inside the prison. Gang leaders often use drug sales to maintain power, forcing lower-ranked inmates into the drug trade in exchange for protection. Mobile phones, cell phones are among the most valuable contraband in La Esperanza. Gang leaders use them to communicate with members outside, coordinate crimes, and even plan murders and extortions from behind bars. These phones are often brought in by corrupt guards for a hefty price. Despite frequent security sweeps, the flow of contraband never stops. Every time the government cracks down, guards find new ways to smuggle items in, sometimes even using drones or corrupt officials to bypass regular checks. Gangs controlling the prison from the inside. In many ways, the gangs inside La Esperanza operate as a shadow government, enforcing their own rules, punishing disobedience, and running criminal enterprises from within the prison walls. The gangs control who gets food, who gets a bed, and who is allowed to live in certain areas of the prison. Gang leaders use bribes to keep guards on their side, ensuring that security forces turn a blind eye to their activities. Some guards are directly on the payroll of MS-13 or Barrio 18, taking orders from gang leaders in exchange for money and protection. If a gang member is caught breaking prison rules, corrupt guards may look the other way if the gang pays them off. If a gang wants to eliminate an enemy inside the prison, they can often bribe a guard to move the target into a vulnerable position, making it easier to attack them. Even prison transfers are influenced by gang leaders, who sometimes pay off officials to have their members move to specific locations where they can continue operating their businesses. The government's role in corruption. While much of the corruption in La Esperanza happens at the prison guard level, it does not stop there. High-ranking officials and even politicians have been accused of negotiating with gang leaders, making secret deals in exchange for political support, reduced violence on the streets, or large sums of money. El Salvador's gang problem has deep political roots, and past governments have been accused of cutting deals with MS-13 and Barrio 18 in exchange for temporary peace. While President Nayib Bukele has taken an extreme approach to cracking down on gangs, his administration has also been accused of secret negotiations with gang leaders, offering them better prison conditions in exchange for reduced crime rates. Extortion and the prison economy. Corruption in La Esperanza has created a shadow economy, where almost everything has a price. Inmates who do not have money or connections are often forced into slave-like conditions, working for gang members in exchange for protection or the bare minimum of survival. Some prisoners are forced to cook, clean, or do laundry for gang leaders in exchange for protection. Others are forced into prostitution by gang members, with corrupt guards facilitating the trade in exchange for bribes. Inmates who do not belong to a gang are often extorted for money. If they do not pay, they are beaten, tortured, or worse. Family members on the outside are also victims of extortion. Many prisoners' relatives receive threats from gang members, forcing them to send money, food, or supplies to their loved ones in prison. If they refuse, their relatives inside La Esperanza suffer violent consequences. Lack of accountability and failed reforms. Despite numerous reports of corruption, very few guards or officials are ever punished. The government frequently announces crackdowns, but these efforts are often more about public relations than real reform. Corrupt guards are rarely fired or prosecuted, and even when investigations are launched, they often lead nowhere due to the deep connections between gang leaders, prison staff, and politicians. The cycle of corruption continues, making it impossible for La Esperanza to function as a true correctional facility. Instead of rehabilitating inmates, the prison system reinforces the same structures of violence, crime, and abuse that dominate the streets of El Salvador. Inmates who enter La Esperanza may hope for justice. But justice is not something that exists in a place where everything has a price. The brutal conditions inside La Esperanza prison don't just affect the physical well-being of its inmates. They take a deep psychological and emotional toll as well. The constant violence, fear, and inhumane living conditions have a devastating impact on the mental health of female prisoners, many of whom entered the prison already carrying deep emotional scars from their lives outside. For many of these women, La Esperanza is not just a prison. It is a living nightmare where every day is a battle for survival. They must navigate the dangers of gang control, abuse from corrupt guards, and the trauma of being cut off from their families, all while enduring overcrowding, malnutrition, and lack of medical care. This environment leads to severe psychological distress, mental illnesses, and even suicidal tendencies among inmates. The trauma of violence and constant fear. One of the biggest psychological challenges female inmates face is the constant fear of violence. In La Esperanza, there is no real safety. At any moment, an inmate could be beaten, tortured, or killed for reasons as small as looking at someone the wrong way or being suspected of betraying the gang. Inmates sleep in shifts because they fear being attacked during the night. Paranoia and anxiety are widespread, as prisoners never know who they can trust. Many women have witnessed multiple murders inside the prison, further deepening their trauma. The sound of screams, fights, and executions is so common that prisoners become desensitized to violence, accepting it as part of daily life. For women who were part of MS-13 or Barrio 18, the psychological burden is even greater. Many of them were involved in extreme violence before entering prison, and now they must relive those experiences while continuing to fight for survival inside. Those who have lost friends, partners, or children to gang violence suffer from intense grief and emotional pain. But there is no space for weakness inside La Esperanza. Showing emotions can be seen as a sign of vulnerability, which makes an inmate a target. Isolation and the pain of separation from family. Another major source of emotional suffering is the forced separation from family members, especially for women who are mothers. Many of these women were arrested while their children were still young, and they have no way of knowing whether their kids are safe, being cared for, or if they will even see them again. Some inmates' children are placed in government shelters, where they often experience poverty, neglect, or even abuse. Other children are left with relatives, but many families are too poor to support them, leading to extreme hardship. In some cases, children of imprisoned gang members are recruited into the gangs themselves, continuing the cycle of violence. Female inmates who were pregnant at the time of their arrest often have their babies taken away from them shortly after birth. These women experience intense psychological distress, as they are left with no closure, no information, and no way to fight for their parental rights. For women who were once deeply involved in gang life, their time in prison often pushes them further into emotional isolation. Many fear reaching out to their families because they know their relatives might reject them due to their criminal past. Others worry that contacting their family could put their loved ones in danger, especially if they were involved in gang conflicts before their arrest. The lack of communication with the outside world worsens their mental health. Many inmates lose hope entirely, as they have no one to write to, no one to visit them, and no support waiting for them when they are eventually released. The effects of solitary confinement and sensory deprivation. As a form of punishment, many inmates are subjected to solitary confinement, a practice known to cause severe psychological damage. Prisoners placed in isolation are kept in small, dark, filthy cells for weeks or even months at a time, with little to no human interaction. Studies have shown that prolonged solitary confinement can cause severe depression and anxiety, hallucinations and paranoia, self-harm and suicidal thoughts, cognitive decline and memory problems. For many inmates, solitary confinement is not just a punishment, it is psychological torture. The sensory deprivation, lack of sunlight, and complete isolation push many prisoners to the brink of insanity. Some inmates lose their grip on reality, experiencing delusions and extreme paranoia that persist even after they are returned to the general population. Mental health neglect and the lack of psychological support. Despite the severe psychological trauma that inmates experience, there are almost no mental health services available in La Esperanza. The prison system in El Salvador is not designed to rehabilitate inmates. It is designed to punish them. There are no professional therapists or counselors available to help inmates deal with their trauma. Prisoners who suffer from severe mental health disorders are often ignored or labeled as problem inmates. Those who attempt suicide are sometimes placed in even worse conditions, rather than given proper psychiatric care. Because mental health is not a priority in the prison system, many inmates turn to self-harm, drugs, or religious faith as ways to cope. Some prisoners join religious groups inside the prison, hoping that faith will give them the strength to survive. Others turn to drugs, using smuggled substances to numb their emotions and escape reality, even if just for a short time. The long-term psychological damage of La Esperanza. For those who eventually leave La Esperanza, the psychological damage remains long after they are released. Many former inmates struggle with PTSD, severe anxiety, and depression for the rest of their lives. Some ex-prisoners cannot sleep properly, haunted by the memories of the violence they witnessed. Others suffer from paranoia, constantly feeling like they are still being watched or that someone is plotting to kill them. Many former inmates find it impossible to reintegrate into society, as they are branded as criminals and rejected by their own families. In many cases, ex-prisoners end up returning to gang life, not because they want to, but because they have no other options. The extreme psychological trauma they endured inside La Esperanza makes it almost impossible for them to function in normal society. Many feel that they are permanently damaged, unworthy of a second chance, and destined for a life of crime or eventual death. The cycle of psychological suffering. The emotional toll of La Esperanza does not just affect the inmates. It also extends to their families, children, and future generations. The trauma experienced by these women does not disappear once they leave prison. It follows them into their communities, shaping the way they raise their children, interact with others, and see the world. For many female prisoners, their time in La Esperanza is not just a sentence. It is a permanent psychological scar that will never fully heal.